Yesterday, I received a final memorandum from Jim Weinstein, the executive director of New Jersey Transit, the person in charge of the working group that I put together about 2.5 weeks ago to work with the federal government on the ARC project to see if there was a way to work around the unacceptable level of risk and cost that was being asked to be borne by the taxpayers of the state of New Jersey.
On October 27th, 2010, New Jersey Governor Chris Christie called a press conference to cancel what would have been the largest public works project in the United States. It was called the ARC project, an acronym for Access to the Region's Core, which is Manhattan, or otherwise known as New York City. It was scheduled to complete in 2018. Its centerpiece was a new passenger rail tunnel under the Hudson River from New Jersey to New York. It would double train capacity, create 6,000 construction jobs, and ultimately 45,000 permanent ones. 22,000 cars a day would be taken off the roads and highways, and each year that would keep 70,000 tons of greenhouse gases from fouling the air. It would provide direct, no transfer rides into Manhattan and decrease commuting times. New Jersey property values would go up by $18 billion, and development along the affected railways would be energized. $100 million would be added to New Jersey's annual income tax receipts, and another $345 would be collected in property taxes. The project's original estimated cost was $8.7 billion, of which the federal government had committed 51%. 34.5% would come from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, using funds generated from tolls, shipping, and airport fees. The state of New Jersey would pay only 14.5%, which they would generate from automobile tolls that had recently been increased specifically for the project. New Jersey would get a state-of-the-art railroad of its own with minimal investment. Congratulations were in order for everyone connected with the project, and with Christie's arrival just as construction was getting started, meant that he could easily take at least some of the credit. But instead, here was a morose and so sadly sincere Governor Chris Christie stepping to a podium to announce the project's cancellation. How could this have happened? The story really begins in the middle 1800s, when railroads were private and were generators of great wealth. In those days, all but one of the eastbound railroads were stopped on the western shore of the Hudson River in New Jersey, where passengers had to get off the train and take a ferry to Manhattan. This is called transferring or changing and is hated by all commuters for the time and effort it wastes every single day. Only Cornelius Vanderbilt's New York Central Railroad had service directly into the city, and he did that by crossing the Hudson 150 miles north near Troy, New York, before turning south and heading directly into his Grand Central Terminal in Midtown. The Pennsylvania Railroad terminated at Exchange Place in Jersey City, and its president, Alexander Cassett, knew that to compete with Vanderbilt, he needed to find a way to get to Manhattan. The Long Island Railroad had a similar problem, though their desire was to move westbound trains across the East River and into the city. In 1900, the two companies jointly developed plans to tunnel under their respective rivers and converge into two side-by-side terminals to be built between 31st and 33rd Streets and 7th and 8th Avenues. For efficiency's sake, Cassett decided to just buy a controlling interest in the Long Island Railroad and then commissioned renowned architects McKim, Mead, and White to build just a single station. But what a station it would be! Cassett acquired all the property between 7th and 10th Avenues and demolished over 500 buildings. To get trains in and out of the station, storage yards were built. The Long Island Railroad Yard would lay to the west between 10th and 12th Avenues. To the east and across the river in Queens would be the Sunnyside Yards. The tunnels coming from the west, which were known as the North River Tunnels, took 4 years to build and finished on October 9, 1906. and the East River tunnels took about 6 years and opened on March 18, 1908. Pennsylvania Station, known to all as Penn Station or just plain Penn, was officially declared complete on October 29, 1910. It was immediately recognized as a masterpiece of the Beaux-Arts style and one of New York City's greatest architectural achievements. Cassett offered the federal government air rights above the tracks between 8th and 9th Avenues, conditioned on their building a post office there. The government accepted and had the same architects build a suitably grand building that was once known as the Farley Post Office. Over 100 years later, it would be annexed to Penn Station and named after Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was an early proponent of the annexation. The cost for the station and all associated tunnels was $114 million, which would be equivalent to $2.3 billion in today's dollars. From planning to completion, it took 10 years, which outlasted Alexander Cassett, who died in 1906. In the early 60s, right around when Chris Christie was born, the financially strapped Pennsylvania Railroad sold the air rights above the tracks, and the glorious Penn Station was callously razed. A nondescript office building and Madison Square Garden were erected above the tracks, and the station was unceremoniously relegated to the basement. To paraphrase Vince Scully, through Pennsylvania Station, where one once entered the city like a god, he now scuttles in like a rat. Beginning in the 1950s and 60s, the use of cars and airplanes cut deeply into the use of trains for passenger travel, so much so that many went out of business. To retain a semblance of a national intercity passenger system, in 1971, the federal government pieced together several bankrupt railroads and formed Amtrak. For cities like New York and states like New Jersey, local commuter trains, subways, and buses were essential to their economic viability, but they too were going out of business, which forced many municipalities to take over their operation. As early as the 1950s, urban planners foresaw a need for additional rail capacity between New Jersey and Manhattan. But it wasn't until 1995 that a major investment study, or MIS, was started. An MIS is a required step in the process of applying for federal aid. In this case, 3 agencies came together. First was New York City's Metropolitan Transportation Authority, or the MTA. It operates and maintains all of New York City's subways and buses, the Long Island Railroad, the Metro-North Railroad, and many, but not all, area bridges and tunnels. The second was New Jersey Transit, or NJT, which runs all the state's trains, buses, and light rail systems. The third participant was the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which is a partnership between the states of New York and New Jersey, formed and sanctioned by the United States Congress in 1921. It is jointly controlled by the governors of each state, who appoint board commissioners and have veto authority over their own appointees. The PA collects tolls and fees from designated bridges, tunnels, sea and airports, and bus terminals that it operates and maintains. The board sees to the equitable funding of capital infrastructure projects that benefit both states. Not involved was Amtrak, who owns the Northeast Corridor rail line between Washington, D.C. and Boston, and it runs through New York. The corridor includes track and bridges that run from Philadelphia through New Jersey, as well as Alexander Cassett's legacy North River tunnels and what's left of Penn Station. New Jersey Transit pays Amtrak about $10 million a month to use these assets. Notwithstanding Christie's claim that the project was a rush job, the MIS took fully 8 years to complete and considered 137 different ways of improving transportation between New York and New Jersey. They concluded that expansion of commuter rail was the most effective approach and studied 4 alternatives in depth. All included a pair of new tunnels under the Hudson River, which for technical reasons took this circuitous route over to Penn. But there was another feature to ARC, an important one. Anyone who's ever done it knows that commuting isn't fun. So any worthwhile project should include improvements that will make it easier and faster. And for nearly the 1 million people living in the northern New Jersey county of Bergen, ARC promised to do just that. 3 NJT rail lines service the area: the Main, the Bergen, and the Pascack Valley. There was a time when all 3 terminated in Hoboken, where you had to get off and either get on a ferry or take the PATH train, which, with its sister tunnel that runs to Wall Street, are the only other rail tunnels that run to Manhattan and are also over 100 years old. The PATH, which is an acronym for the Port Authority Trans-Hudson Line, goes first into Greenwich Village and then up 6th Avenue, where it makes a few stops and then terminates at 33rd Street, just a block east of Penn Station. Things improved a little for these commuters with the 2003 opening of the Frank Lautenberg Station in Secaucus. The station enabled them to get off the Bergen trains and onto ones that were coming from the south and west that ran directly into Penn through the north tunnels. They still had to change, but it took a little less time. But ARC was another story. All alternatives included the addition of a loop track at Secaucus, which meant Bergen County commuters could stay in their seats and ride all the way into Penn Station. This would take at least 15 minutes off their travel time in both directions, which to somebody who does this twice a day is life-altering. 2 of the 4 alternatives recommended by the MIS ran trains from the new tunnels into the existing Penn Station and then on to Grand Central Station. These approaches were reviewed by commuter groups as the most desirable because riders would get a no-transfer ride to either Penn Station or Grand Central. NJT and Amtrak would also gain tunnel use flexibility, but the increase in passenger capacity was limited by the unchanged number of tracks running into Penn Station. But more importantly, they had much higher degrees of complexity, operational risk, and cost. As a result, the MIS group decided to remove them from consideration. A third alternative connected the tunnel to the existing Penn Station, but didn't go on to Grand Central. Instead, a new tunnel to Queens was proposed, which would increase the number of peak trains per hour and would ultimately allow a new route for Amtrak trains on the Northeast Corridor. A fourth alternative called for building a new, deep cavern, stub-end station directly underneath the current Penn Station. Stub end means the New Jersey Transit trains would terminate there, but it was the only alternative that doubled NJT train capacity during rush hour, far more than the other options. The director of NJT at the time was George Warrington, and he was strongly in favor of building the deep cavern station. Still, even with the bias, the 2003 MIS report recommended that alternatives 3 and 4 move on to the next step in the application process. Commuter groups were angry that no alternatives connected to Grand Central and derided the stub-end station as one that went only to Macy's basement and didn't connect with existing transportation infrastructure. This was not true. The ARC Tunnel station would have underground passageways that would connect to all nearby subway stations, as well as Penn Station itself. Not only that, but the tunnels could be extended to both Grand Central and Queens as soon as New York City completed a section of water tunnel, which, as it turned out, was completed in plenty of time. In 2006, the FTA allowed preliminary engineering for the project to begin, but after expert peer review in 2007, serious technical problems were discovered with connecting the tunnels to the existing and unexpanded Penn Station. Due to limits on rail grade, the option necessitated in-river construction, which required building what are known as cofferdams. This is no small endeavor. It begins with a circular work area that's created by pile-driving corrugated steel plates into the river bottom. Then, the work area is pumped dry, and people and equipment are lowered to the bottom. Adding more complexity, the Hudson River had been declared a federal Superfund site, which meant that the EPA would have to approve the disruption of all that contaminated mud. There's a possibility that that might not happen, or at the very least, cause delays. Additionally, The cofferdam would cause disruptions to river navigation, which had to be approved by the Coast Guard. Another problem was tunnel construction in Manhattan that would displace many West Side businesses and residents. This would bring community boards and other stakeholder organizations into the mix. For these reasons, the group determined that connecting to the existing Penn Station carried too many environmental, community, and engineering risks, and the deep cavern approach avoided them by simply passing below them. In March of 2008, the Federal Transportation Agency approved a supplemental draft environmental impact statement that covered the new Deep Cavern Station, which had been moved a block north of the existing Penn Station, right under 34th Street. The final environmental impact statement was approved in October of 2008. Though this was the outcome that George Warrington favored in 2003, it's notable that he retired in 2007 and died in 2008 of pancreatic cancer. In January of 2009, the FTA issued a record of decision for the project and approved the start of the agreed-upon design. In June of 2009, a contract for a new railroad underpass at Tunnel Avenue in North Bergen, New Jersey was awarded, accompanied by a groundbreaking ceremony with first-term Governor John Corzine. Corzine wasn't the most beloved governor in New Jersey's history, having come under fire for the state's budget deficit, pension problems, and a scandal involving an ex-girlfriend. He was so unpopular that in 2007, his state trooper-driven vehicle was in an accident that nearly killed him. But rather than receive sympathy, he was criticized for not wearing his seatbelt. Getting ARC over the finish line was one of Corzine's biggest achievements, and he hoped that it would get him reelected in 2009. Chris Christie was his Republican challenger, along with a third-party candidate, Chris Daggett. Daggett was a former New Jersey Commissioner of Environmental Protection and had been endorsed by the New Jersey chapter of the Sierra Club, then headed by Jeff Tittle. Tittle was unhappy with Corzine's environmental record and believed his third-party candidate could win. On Election Day, Daggett drew about 6% of the vote, leaving Christie to beat Corzine by 3.5 percentage points. Christie was sworn in on January 19, 2010, as the nation recovered from the severe economic collapse of 2008. Governmental programs to stabilize the economy had been implemented by both Democrats and Republicans, and though they'd proved to be effective, at the time they were derided as examples of what was wrong with big government. American politics were shifting rightward, and populism was gaining traction. With money from billionaires like David and Charles Koch, the way was paved for the rise of the Tea Party faction of the Republican Party. They were against big government, government spending, deficit spending, universal health care, social programs, military involvements, and pretty much everything except lower taxes. During his campaign, Christie was a supporter of the tunnel, and why not? It was embraced by labor, transportation, environmental advocates, and most commuters. It had undergone and passed years of environmental and engineering analysis, and that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Funding had already been arranged, and construction was underway for a railroad that would almost entirely benefit New Jersey citizens. The state was directly paying only 14.5% of the total price. What was not to like? But Christie had also campaigned as a straight-talking, no-nonsense Jersey guy who had promised to put the state's financial affairs in order. Not only that, but he also promised he could do it without any tax increases. It got him elected, but wouldn't you know it, he found the state's financial condition in worse condition than he thought. Not long after swearing in, Christie's newly appointed Commissioner of Transportation, Jim Simpson, reported that the fund that was supposed to provide money for roads was essentially insolvent. This was the state's Transportation Trust Fund, or TTF, that was set up in 1984 by Tom Kean, who is perhaps the most popular Republican governor in New Jersey history. He had pushed through a massive infrastructure program and established the TTF to fund it with money that was raised through the state's taxes on fuels and gasoline. The tax hadn't been raised since 1988, and at 14 cents a gallon was the third lowest in the nation. So the question becomes, why was it insolvent? That's an easy one, because New Jersey governors and legislators of both parties had for decades raided the fund to address short-term budget gaps that had nothing to do with roads. In 2010, New Jersey's state budget listed a capital budget of $3.5 billion, with $1.6 billion of it coming from the TTF, which was pure fiction. In actuality, the fuels tax had raised only $483 million. But the worst of it was, just about all of it was pledged to pay interest on bonds sold by prior administrations against the fund's future earnings. So the only way for the TTF to come up with its share of the money in 2010 was to sell even more bonds and further mortgage its future and hasten its downward death spiral. A bump in the gas tax would have been easy to explain and not too politically damaging once it was blamed on Corzine, but I guess Christie thought his credibility was on the line. But the state had critical projects on the docket, and the biggest was the 3.5-mile-long Pulaski Skyway. The 78-year-old erector set-looking structure between Newark and Jersey City was functionally obsolete and structurally deficient. They needed $1.8 billion to fix it, but the state said it wouldn't have that money for about 10 years, which in New Jersey state budget speak means never. But with the 2007 collapse of a similarly designed bridge in Minneapolis, the work couldn't wait. But where else could the money come from? It's instructive that one of the first things that Christie did as governor was to appoint New Jersey State Senator and loyal sycophant Bill Baroni to be the Port Authority's Deputy Executive Director. Within a month, Baroni and Christie used the PA to keep the city of Bayonne from going into bankruptcy, which would have cost the state tens of millions of unbudgeted dollars. Baroni had somehow found out that the city owned a parcel of land that was tied up in legal wrangling, which was somehow made to go away. But then in April of 2010, the Port Authority bought the land for which they had no use and paid $235 million for it, which everyone agrees was way over market value. But that was okay because the state had one less headache, courtesy of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. In May of 2010, a position that had no job description was created at the authority for David Wildstein, an influential New Jersey political blogger who had gone to high school with Christie and would be his old classmates' eyes and ears at the agency. Though widely despised and feared, Wildstein's work ethic, intelligence, and political savvy couldn't be denied. He became what was called the Director of Interstate Capital Projects. Wildstein immediately focused on the ARC project, and most importantly, the agency's $3 billion commitment to it. He was able to determine that at least some of the money could be redirected to New Jersey road projects. But first, the ARC tunnel had to be deep-sixed. In addition to the Port Authority's, or PA's, money, there was another $1.25 billion that Corzine had committed to the project through a dedicated New Jersey Turnpike toll increase that was already generating funds. The state wouldn't have to ask anybody's permission to divert those funds, and the two together would allow Christie to fund Pulaski while holding the line on his straight-talking pledge of no new taxes, at least until he got through his re-election campaign that was coming in 2013. But time to act was short. In December of 2009, New Jersey Transit had already awarded a $583 million tunnel contract for boring the Manhattan tunnels. In midsummer, Wildstein learned that NJT was on the brink of issuing another $500 million tunnel boring contract on the New Jersey side. Not only that, they were on the verge of issuing irreversible eminent domain proceedings. And if those went ahead, the project would be unstoppable. Working through the PA's ARC Executive Committee, Wildstein and Baroni were laying the groundwork to kill off the ARC project. In late August of 2010, the committee formally recommended that all work on the project cease for a period of 30 days. It was said that this was to allow a review of costs and possible overruns. On Friday, September 10th, Christie announced the receipt of the recommendation and that he was going to follow it. The announcement came as a surprise to almost everyone and sent ARC proponents into a panic, with some of them hoping it was just a negotiation ploy to get more money from the feds. To the shock and surprise of almost everyone, on October 7th, 2010, Christie issued a second statement, this one announcing that because the ARC project would substantially exceed its budget and that New Jersey alone would have to cover overruns, he was accepting the recommendation of the PA's committee to terminate it. The PA's executive committee consisted of commissioners from both states, and while we know why Christie's people wanted it dead, why did New York sign on? The financial crisis of 2008 had severely depressed toll and fee collections, and the cost of rebuilding the World Trade Center was running way over budget. The way the Port Authority functions is simply that one hand washes the other. So if New Jersey wanted to get out of ARC, that was fine with New York as long as they repaid the favor when the roles were reversed. But to abide by their federal charter, they had to claim that the Skyway was an approach to another Port Authority property. In a brilliantly made argument before a sympathetic judge, they might have gotten away with selling it as a connector to the Holland Tunnel, but an arcane historical rule precluded them from taking that approach. That left them to argue that the Skyway was connected to the Lincoln Tunnel. And that would be a much harder case to make, but was a problem only if somebody decided to challenge it. And the calculation was, nobody would. The day after the cancellation, Obama's National Transportation Secretary, Ray LaHood, flew to New Jersey. He asked Christie for more time to investigate some ideas he had, and after 15 years of planning and hundreds of millions of dollars spent on the preliminary work, Christie gave LaHood 2 weeks. 2 weeks. If this was a negotiating tactic, it worked. LaHood came back with substantial proposals. He produced an additional $358 million in direct grants from the feds, and another $358 million that would somehow come through the Port Authority. There was talk of setting up a public-private partnership that might be able to mitigate any cost overruns. If that didn't cover it, New Jersey would be eligible for a low-cost federal loan. In other words, the federal government was willing to do whatever it took to keep the project on course. None of it satisfied Christie, LaHood said, even with all these extra goodies. LaHood would later lament that Christie just wouldn't take yes for an answer. On October 27, 2010, Christie went before cameras and terminated America's largest public works project.
Their best estimates now are that the ARC tunnel will cost no less than $11 billion and could exceed $14 billion. In light of that information, the executive committee has made a recommendation to me that the project be terminated and that the staff begin an expeditious and orderly wind down of the project. And today I have accepted that recommendation.
The sincere straight-talker made no mention that he was going to raid the PA ARC tunnel funds, but that was okay. The cancellation instantly raised Christie's political profile, and by the time the Republican presidential primary was kicking into gear in early 2011, there was talk of drafting the straight-talking tough guy from New Jersey to deny Obama a second term. The murmur intensified when candidates Donald Trump and Mike Huckabee dropped out of the race. For an ex-freeholder and politically appointed U.S. attorney who once expressed astonishment that he had defeated billionaire John Corzine in an overwhelmingly Democratic state, hearing such speculation had to be intoxicating. If he had not before, Chris Christie started looking in the mirror and seeing for the first time the President of the United States of America. But for reasons of his own, he didn't get into the race, which just might have been the biggest political blunder he would ever make. During his cancellation speech, Chris Christie stated that it was the terms of the Full Funding Agreement, or FFA, that explained why it would be imprudent for the state of New Jersey to proceed with the project. An FFA memorializes the federal government's commitment to providing funds for a project, and under normal conditions, it's what applicants desire most. But instead, Christie stated that it was the FFA that informed him that all the cost overruns would be borne by the lead agency, which just wasn't true. Now, New Jersey was the lead agency, but a year earlier, in another bit of federal grant application business called the General Project Agreement, or the GPA, both New Jersey Transit and the Port Authority agreed to work together to obtain additional funding sources if cost overruns occurred. Not at all unreasonable for the receipt of the largest commitment of federal money in the history of the United States. Granted, despite the project's original cost estimate of $8.7 billion, the Department of Transportation had issued project risk assessments that estimated the low-range cost of the project at $9.775 billion, a mid-range estimate of $10.847 billion, and a high-end range of $12.708 billion. The estimates, however, include a $1.7 billion contingency, which is put in to cover costs that may or may not occur. If you take those out, the range is much more in line with what the experts originally foresaw, including Christie's own New Jersey Transit, who'd consistently said that the top-end cost wouldn't exceed $10 billion. Also worth taking notice of, if there were any cost overruns, they wouldn't have surfaced for some number of years, during which New Jersey would have enjoyed the 6,000 construction jobs and the new economic activity that came along with them. The project was slated to take 7 years, and as everyone knows, just a week in politics is a lifetime. But for the sake of argument, let's assume that the project went ahead, and in 2016, New Jersey and its partner, the Port Authority, needed more funding. If it were a small amount, it's possible that it could be easily dealt with using funds that were already available. Or if the need was larger, the partners could accept the government's low-interest loan, and New Jersey could just use a portion of the ARC-generated taxes to pay it off. Or maybe New Jersey wouldn't want to take the loan and refuse to pay any more money for the tunnel. Does anybody really believe that the project would be abandoned? Of course not, but subsequent events make the matter moot. We now know that there probably wouldn't be any issue around shortfalls because of Hurricane Sandy that devastated the entire East Coast in October of 2012. Billions of dollars in damages were caused, including the flooding and severe damage of the North River tunnels. The event underscored the need for added tunnel capacity, and had ARC been underway, almost certainly federal funds would have poured in to hasten its completion. The list of possibilities goes on, but in 2010, we're asked to believe that a savvy politician is leaving nearly $4 billion in federal money on the table, $1.2 billion in Port Authority money, and canceling a fully cleared project that would have immediately benefited his constituents and generated great economic activity and tax receipts, all because of something that may or may not happen at some unknown point in the future. The Government Accounting Office, or GAO, which is a nonpartisan investigative branch of Congress, took a year to study ARC's cancellation. In March of 2012, their report clearly showed that Christie significantly overstated the project's possible budget overruns and had canceled the project without any final agreement on who would be responsible for them. To see what he was really up to, all one need do is read his January 2011 proposal for renewal of the Transportation Trust Fund. Unsurprisingly, $1.8 billion of it was coming from the Port Authority's ARC commitment. Another $1.3 billion was coming from the New Jersey Turnpike, who, as you'll remember, had raised tolls specifically to pay for the ARC tunnels and the new station. But despite Christie's pledge to protect New Jersey residents from future financial obligations, the bulk of the TTF's funding would come from the issuance of another $4 billion in public debt. As it turned out, the $1.8 billion spent on the Pulaski Skyway renovation did not escape legal scrutiny. The SEC challenged the fiction that Pulaski was a feeder to the Lincoln Tunnel, and New York's DA opened an investigation into the matter. Further fallout was a demand by the federal government that New Jersey pay back $271 million that had been advanced for the project, with the condition that it be repaid if New Jersey backed out of the deal. Christie went to court and later settled the matter by returning $95 million to the feds and agreeing to spend $128 million on DOT-approved transit-related projects. Within months, the heretofore conspicuously absent Amtrak stepped in to see if they couldn't get some of that federal transportation money that Christie left on the table. In February of 2011, then Amtrak President Joseph Boardman, along with U.S. Senators Frank Lautenberg and Robert Menendez, announced a new project called Gateway. It was reported that Christie bragged that it was his canceling of ARC that triggered the project, which he claimed was far superior. He repeated the fiction that ARC terminated in Macy's basement and went on to claim that his wife Mary Pat shared this misconception and had lobbied him to terminate ARC because she erroneously believed it would hurt her commute to her lucrative investment banking job downtown. The Gateway project is akin to ARC, but more Amtrak-centric. Rather than building a new underground subway-connected station just for NJT trains, the new tunnels would go into an expanded Penn Station, presumably under 31st Street, though I wonder if it would interfere with the foundations of the buildings across the street. But assuming it's possible, the tracks would dead end there, just like with the ARC program. But most disappointingly for New Jersey riders was that the no-transfer ride promised by ARC was at first not even part of Gateway. It was only after a loud and sustained outcry from New Jersey commuter groups that it was tacked on as an option for some point in the future, which, as we all now probably know, means it will never happen. Gateway supposedly included money to replace the 100-year-old Portal Bridge, over which all Northeast Corridor and most New Jersey transit trains ran. The bridge was prone to getting stuck in the open position and occasionally caught fire. To fix the Portal Bridge once and for all, Gateway planned to erect 2 fixed spans. Remember that, 2 fixed spans, with enough clearance to allow all river traffic to pass beneath it. In 2011, the entire Gateway plan, which included the Portal Bridge and the Penn Station expansion, was estimated to cost $13.5 billion, which was obviously a lowball estimate and had a completion date of, don't laugh, 2020. No money had yet been budgeted, and tens of millions of dollars were needed just to start engineering, which alone would take 4 years. As part of the Obama administration's 2009 stimulus bill, Florida had been awarded $2.4 billion for a high-speed rail development. However, another Tea Party darling, Rick Scott, had been elected governor in 2010 and, like Christie, decided he couldn't afford to accept the money, which went back to Washington. A nationwide scramble for it ensued. In April of 2011, Amtrak applied for $1.3 billion of the money, which included $238 million for preliminary engineering for the Gateway tunnels and the New York Penn Station expansion, and another $570 million to replace the Portal Bridge. This request came with a letter from Chris Christie to Ray LaHood pledging New Jersey's support for the project, and LaHood must have marveled at Christie's nerve, having received a similar letter for the ARC project a year earlier. The completion date for the 2 Portal Bridges was, and no laughter please, 2017 or 2018. Alas, in May of 2011, it was announced that no money would be awarded for either Gateway or the Portal Bridge. Along the way, it was noticed that in 2010, the MTA had sold the air rights above the former Long Island Railroad yard, and that a massive $25 billion development would be built atop a gigantic concrete platform. It was realized that to protect Gateway's right-of-way, cement casement tunnels needed to be built first between 10th and 11th Avenues, and later between 11th and 12th. As usual, there was no money for this. When Hurricane Sandy hit New York in October of 2012, Amtrak applied to the U.S. Department of Transportation for funding to help cover damages caused by the hurricane. And on May 20th, 2013, Ray LaHood announced that $185 million in Sandy relief would be granted to Amtrak. A large portion of this money would go to starting the casement tunnels for Gateway. These would be Gateway's tunnels from and to nowhere, least of all Macy's. Just as work on the first casement tunnel was starting in September of 2013, there was a bizarre development on the Port Authority's George Washington Bridge. It was during Monday morning's rush hour, and without notice, somebody at the Port Authority closed most of the bridge's local access toll lanes to the city of Fort Lee. This caused severe backups and delays, which turned out to threaten public safety. Initially, the PA claimed it was just a routine traffic study, but later investigation revealed that it was probably political payback for Fort Lee's mayor, Mark Sokolich, who had refused to endorse Christie for re-election as governor. Nobody really knows why a Democrat was supposed to endorse a Republican governor, but the ensuing investigation honed in on several of Christie's appointees and staff, including his chief of staff, Bridget Ann Kelly, and his favorite political appointees and sycophants at the Port Authority, David Wildstein and Bill Baroni. Wildstein, who derisively referred to Sokolich as the Little Serbian, pled guilty to ordering the lane closures. To save his own skin, he testified for days against Kelly and Baroni, who received jail sentences while he got off with just probation. Chris Christie insisted that he knew nothing about this incident and distanced himself from Wildstein. Didn't really know him in high school, he said. But there was testimony that he at least knew about the closures while they were happening. Christie was never charged with wrongdoing, but in an attempt to salvage his reputation, he sort of apologized anyway.
And I come out here today to apologize to the people of New Jersey.
This incident reflected poorly on Christie's statewide popularity and tarnished his image as the straight-talking New Jersey tough guy. Despite that, he was still looking in the mirror and seeing the president, which on June 30th, 2015, prompted him to announce his entry into the Republican primary. That same month, Donald Trump glided down his golden escalator and announced his candidacy for president. Nobody thought he had a chance, but he was making immigration the centerpiece of his campaign and promised to build a great wall to show his building and negotiating chops. In September of 2015, together with New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, Christie declared Gateway to be a great project and that New York and New Jersey would pay for half of it if the federal government committed to the other half. This would more than double what the state of New Jersey would have been on the hook for ARC. As a presidential candidate now, Christie no longer cared about where the money for Gateway was coming from, nor did he raise the subject of overruns. Instead, he committed to writing a blank check for Gateway, 25% of the total, whatever it was. And everyone knew it wouldn't be $13.5 billion. But with Obama still president and a gateway and infrastructure proponent, Barack went ahead and committed the United States to paying for half of Gateway's cost, whatever it was. In November of 2015, Amtrak, Senators Booker and Schumer, and the newly minted infrastructure proponent and blank check writer Chris Christie joined Andrew Cuomo to announce the creation of a new Gateway Development Corporation that would oversee the project. Its board would come from the Port Authority, Amtrak, and most importantly, the U.S. Department of Transportation. Having the feds on the board would really ensure once and for all the backing of the U.S. government. On February 10th, 2016, after finishing 10th in the Iowa caucuses and 6th in New Hampshire, Christie quit the primary race. On February 26th, he stunned everyone and endorsed Donald Trump. Almost immediately, there was talk that Christie might be Trump's choice for vice president. In March of 2016, Amtrak and the PA committed $35 million each to continue design and engineering work for a gateway. Remember the TTF? Well, as summer approached, it was clear that it was bankrupt, and road projects had to be abandoned mid-job all through the summer of 2016. Finally, on September 30th, Christie more than doubled the New Jersey state gas tax, which was mandated to bring in at least $2 billion a year for the fund. Still, he insisted on offsetting the gas tax increase with decreases elsewhere that ultimately resulted in all three credit rating agencies lowering New Jersey's credit rating. By the time he left office, only Illinois had a lower bond rating than New Jersey. On November 8, 2016, Donald Trump was elected president, making it appear that Christie's bold political gamble had paid off. Part of Christie's political calculation depended on the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, not holding a grudge against Christie for prosecuting his father Charles in 2003. The elder Kushner had been charged with making illegal political contributions, and in an attempt to escape prosecution, engaged in a witness tampering scheme that Christie would later describe as the most loathsome and disgusting crime that he had ever prosecuted during his 10 years as the U.S. Attorney for the state of New Jersey. It was in this role that Christie negotiated a plea agreement where Charles pled guilty to several crimes in exchange for a 2-year jail sentence. His loyal and loving son Jared, then a college student, flew down to see him almost every weekend. Based on the political plums Chris Christie did not get from Trump, I'd say Jared never forgot. In 2017, the ghost of the Pulaski Skyway paid a visit to the Port Authority. The Security Exchange Commission's investigation resulted in a $400 million fine levied against the Port Authority for misusing and misrepresenting the use of PA's funds. Effectively, New Jersey would pay half of this, or $200 million. Also in January of 2017, the newly formed Gateway Development Group met for the first time. 6 months later, Trump's Department of Transportation permanently withdrew themselves from the corporation's board of trustees. This was not seen as a sign of good things to come. In June of 2017, the first of the casement tunnels were completed. They cost $250 million. The remaining casements between 11th and 12th Avenues would begin at some indefinite time in the future at a cost of $385 million, for which, as you might guess, there was no money. On September 7, 2017, Trump met with Cuomo, Christie, Schumer, Booker, Gillibrand, Elaine Chao, Gary Cohn, Mick Mulvaney, and John Kelly, and Peter King to discuss Gateway. King would later say that he walked out of that meeting believing that Trump was behind the project 100%. As the group was departing, though, Senator Schumer of New York was asked to stay behind for a private meeting. He didn't have much to say about this at the time, but later sources who were there said that Trump pledged financing for Gateway, but only if Schumer supported the border wall. Schumer refused. I thought the Mexicans were going to pay for it. In the same month, Charles W. Moorman, a co-chief executive of Amtrak, said he was hopeful that Trump would honor Obama's commitment to cover half of the cost of the project, which by then was called the Gateway Program. The total had climbed to $29 billion, though it did include fixing more track and other Amtrak bridges in New Jersey. Reminding Trump that it was Obama's commitment was a serious mistake. In late December of 2017, Trump officially declared that Obama's funding offer was withdrawn, and if the states wanted Gateway, they would have to pay for it themselves. So much for having friends in high places. Christie left the New Jersey governorship on January 16, 2018. His approval rating was an abysmal 14%. Democrat Phil Murphy took his place. In March of 2018, Donald Trump threatened to veto the entire omnibus spending bill if it had any funds in it for Gateway, as was confirmed by Elaine Chao, his Secretary of Transportation, and Mitch McConnell's wife.
So the Washington Post reported, Secretary Chao, that President Trump recently personally requested that Speaker Ryan block the federal funding for the Gateway project in the omnibus spending package. What can you tell us about that? Is that true?
I read it in the newspapers just like you did.
Right. My question was, is it true?
It probably is.
Is the President of the United States personally intervening with the Speaker to kill this project?
The President, yes, the President is concerned about the viability of this project and the fact that New York and New Jersey have no skin in the game.
Boy, did King ever misread Trump's reaction to Gateway, huh? Trump had found out that a New Jersey Republican congressman, Rodney Frelinghuysen, had inserted $900 million into the bill for Gateway, and Trump wanted it out. To his credit, the soon-to-retire Frelinghuysen managed to sneak $540 million onto the budget and passed the Gateway-hating master builder Trump. On June 24, 2019, yet another bi-state agency was formed to oversee the planning, funding, and construction of the Gateway program's rail tunnels and bridges. Each state would be responsible for 50% of the funding, and that it would be up to them to pursue whatever monies they could get from federal, state, and local sources. So that meant New Jersey had signed up to fund $14.5 billion for Gateway, further testament to the long-lasting and costly consequences of Christie's ill-conceived and short-sighted cancellation of the ARC tunnel, which, don't forget, would have cost New Jersey about $1.25 billion. Even worse, by 2019, trains would have already been running through those tunnels and into New York. In January 2020, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo proposed enlarging Penn Station by acquiring and demolishing a full city block into which would run 8 new tracks, all of which would also stub end, just like with ARC. This went well beyond Gateway's southward expansion and carried a price tag of $8 billion. Maybe more. Cuomo claimed that his plan could accommodate Gateway's new tunnels, but wasn't reliant on them. In February of 2020, the Federal Transportation Administration gave the Gateway Tunnel a medium-low rank, which means it is not qualified for federal grant money. A month later, they notified the Gateway Commissioners of their refusal to complete their environmental review of Gateway until it qualified for federal funding. New Jersey Transit, Amtrak, and the Port Authority all complained that the ruling ran counter to normal practice, but it didn't seem like anybody cared. Probably because Frelinghuysen had already funded it, the Trump administration upgraded the Portal Bridge project to a priority rating of medium-high, which meant that they could apply for the money that Frelinghuysen had set aside for them and had been sitting there unused. Portal Bridge had grown to become a $1.8 billion project, and Governor Murphy committed the state to fund $600 million of it. In May of 2020, the Federal Railroad Administration announced the award of $55.1 million to Amtrak and New Jersey Transit to advance the Portal Bridge. Right around that time, Governor Phil Murphy dined with Trump at his New Jersey golf club, after which Trump agreed to get the United States Department of Transportation to move forward to provide the project with $766.5 million. For some reason, Gateway's planners weren't as concerned with the engineering problems foreseen by the ARC team of running tunnels directly into Penn Station. Remember the in-river construction and cofferdams stirring up poisonous muck at the bottom of the Hudson River? That's still part of the Gateway plan, though it appears that they're going to tunnel closer to the river's bottom, creating a condition called low cover. Low cover means that above the tunneling machine, there's going to be less material than what's required to keep it from collapsing. To deal with this, the overhead material has to be what is called improved, and in this case that will be done by injecting thousands of thin shafts of concrete into the river bottom. Gateway will also breach the Hudson River bulkhead, which runs along the west side of Manhattan. The bulkhead is an elaborate dock, which incredibly was conceived in 1870 by former Union Civil War General George B. McClellan. He's probably best remembered for his reluctance to engage the enemy, for which Lincoln finally relieved him of his command. He mounted an unsuccessful presidential campaign against Lincoln in 1864 And afterwards, he was given the job of chief engineer for New York City's Department of Docks. At the time, the project was the nation's biggest public works project, and subsequently earned a place on the nation's Register of Historic Places. Archaeologists might want to monitor, document, and inspect the wall as it's being drilled through, and who knows what they might find down there, and what kind of delays that could cause. Of note, all ARC alternatives plan to tunnel below the bulkhead to avoid these issues. Leaving the river, the tunnels continue under the West Side Highway, and to avoid all the problems caused by digging up the streets of Manhattan, as the ARC engineers had foreseen as necessary and rejected as impractical, Gateway would instead tunnel beneath them, though another low cover condition will have to be dealt with. To do this, the ground will be improved by literally freezing the earth solid through the use of large refrigerated tubes. These somewhat novel construction methods are in wide enough use, but I worry that having so many obstacles to deal with will leave the project susceptible to costly delays. On October 1st, 2020, Christie's Forget-Me-Not gas tax added nearly another dime per gallon, bringing it up to 51 cents, and making New Jersey's gas tax the 10th highest in the nation. On November 6, 2020, Gateway opponent Donald Trump lost his bid for re-election to longtime railroad supporter and Amtrak passenger Joe Biden, who has stated his belief that the Gateway project is the most important infrastructure project in the United States. For the first time in American history, a sitting president refused to concede defeat nor assure the peaceful transition of power. Most elected Republican officials have nothing to say about this, but Christie is among the first to call Trump out on it.
Well, listen, the legal theory put forward by his legal team and by the president is an absurdity. And the reason why the Supreme Court didn't take it is because it's an absurd idea to think that any state or any number of states, no matter how good they are, can challenge another state's right to run the election as they see fit. And also, there's no evidence, as I've been saying since election night, show us the evidence.
Though probably not his original intent, Andrew Cuomo of New York throws everyone for a loop when he endorses a report that opines that the 104-year-old Hudson River tunnels need to be repaired immediately. But, they say, the work can proceed without impacting service if it's done at night and on weekends. It would take a little less than 3 years and cost only $1.8 billion. The study stemmed from Cuomo's experience with the 14th Street Tunnel that was also damaged by Hurricane Sandy floodwaters. At first, U.S. engineers had said complete shutdowns would be needed to repair the damage. But after consulting with experts from Columbia and Cornell universities and the Tesla Corporation, the nights and weekends approach was adopted. And it worked. The 14th Street Tunnel was repaired in record time, at lower cost, and an enormous New York City transportation problem was averted. Before Cuomo pitched his uninvited 2 cents into the mix, it had been an article of faith that repairing the existing Hudson tunnels would mean shutting them down completely, one at a time, for over a year each. That capacity loss was considered intolerable, which meant the repair work couldn't start until new tunnels were finished, and that would take 8 years, which added urgency to getting them started. But with the repair now considered possible, coupled with the catastrophic reduction in ridership due to COVID, and perhaps a permanent reduction in workers needing to go to the city every day, some people start whispering that perhaps Gateway isn't needed at all. Gateway proponents claim Cuomo's solution won't work on the North River tunnels for technical reasons. Cuomo insisted that the new approach wasn't a substitute for Gateway and argues that both projects can proceed at the same time. By December 10, 2020, to move the Portal Bridge replacement along, the New Jersey Transit Board signs the required full funding agreement, the very same agreement that Christie used as an excuse for canceling ARC. It includes the exact same provision that New Jersey Transit and its partners have to pay for cost overruns. Unfortunately, with the passage of time, the amount budgeted for the job allows for only one 2-track bridge to be built, with with the second one put off to sometime in the future. And we all know what that means by now. The updated full funding agreement has New Jersey Transit paying $811 million, Amtrak $262 million, and federal government sources totaling $824 million. Total cost is just about $1.9 billion, and that's for a project scaled down by more than half. The full funding agreement was submitted to Congress on December 11, 2020, and was finally signed on January 14, 2021. The plan is for the bridge's construction to start in earnest in the spring. The state of New Jersey will end up paying just $439 million less than it would have paid for the entire ARC project. On December 16, 2020, President-elect Joe Biden declared that he would appoint rising Democratic star Pete Buttigieg to be his Secretary of Transportation. With Trump leaving and fresh eyes on the project, many mass transit proponents think Gateway's time has finally come. Perhaps, but its nearly fruitless 10-year journey only makes what might have been all that much more frustrating. Hadn't Chris Christie terminated the ARC program under false pretenses, right now there'd be a brand new tunnel running from New Jersey into Manhattan with connections to the city's subway system and Penn Station. Many New Jersey commuters for the first time would be enjoying no transfer rides directly into Manhattan. By now, the transportation villages would have sprung up along the new direct train lines and be generating the long-ago foreseen increased tax receipts and economic development. The decrease in car use would be keeping tons of pollutants out of the air and water, making New Jersey a more attractive place to live. With the addition of the new deep cavern Penn Station, Amtrak would share the existing Penn with only the Long Island Railroad, who in 2022 will need less space due to the completion of its new stub-end terminal 128 feet below Grand Central Station. For snarky ARC haters, this can be called the train to Grand Central's basement. The Long Island Railroad station's similarities to ARC are eerie and show that in a place as densely developed as Manhattan, often the best, fastest, and cheapest way to avoid obstacles is by tunneling underneath them. This practical thinking was behind George Warrington's endorsement of the deep cavern station and his refusal to allow the perfect to be the enemy of the possible. And if the stars are at last aligned for new tunnels under the Hudson, maybe the ARC approach should be reconsidered. Building ARC as originally conceived would avoid all the technical issues around Gateway, and there'd be no need for Cuomo to raise $8 billion to expand Penn Station. That money could be better used to connect the new 34th Street station to its Long Island Railroad counterpart below Grand Central. With New York's new water tunnel no longer an obstacle, tunnels could also be dug to Sunnyside, and these new routes would open the region to heretofore unimagined public travel possibilities. As for Christie, don't worry about him. He's been busy reinventing himself as a reasoned and objective political expert on television, but it's a pretty good indication that he's still looking in the mirror and seeing you-know-who. Which is okay. I mean, the guy must have something going for him. He was just a freeholder, for God's sake, and somehow rose to the governorship. And if he hadn't prosecuted Charlie Kushner, probably would have been vice president or maybe sitting on the Supreme Court. His early move to distance himself from Trump was probably wise. But let's face it, his early endorsement of the guy played a big role in his becoming the president. But people like him, and I get that. But one thing besides this that should forever be associated with Chris Christie, and that's the cancellation of the ARC project. As New York Senator Chuck Schumer said in 2015, Chris Christie's canceling of ARC is sure to be labeled one of the worst moves made by any political figure in the New York area in over 100 years. Or as New Jersey's great champion of public transportation, the late and great U.S. Senator Frank Lautenberg said, "Killing the ARC tunnel will go down as one of the biggest public policy blunders in New Jersey history." It will, Frank, and forever may Chris Christie's name be burdened by its weight.